Hello, I'm Andrew Arch. I'm a Principal Accessibility Consultant with Intopia, and I also chair the Standards Australia IT40 Committee looking after accessible ICT. Neil and I today are going to talk to you about accessible procurement and how you can work with the Australian standard EN 301549 to improve the accessibility of your ICT products. Neil, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, I'm Neil King, National Manager of Digital Access here at Vision Australia, and also a member of the Standards Australia Committee, like Andrew mentioned.
Thanks, Neil. Today we're going to, in the next 20 minutes, talk about why accessible procurement matters, what happens if you don't take it into account early on. We're going to dive into the Australian standard, that's the applicable standard for accessible ICT procurement, and finish off with a few things that your organisation can do to bring accessibility into your procurement processes. Neil, I'll throw to you to start this part of the discussion.
Thanks, Andrew. So when we think of public procurement, I just want to kind of go back maybe to the definition provided by the OECD. So public procurement refers to purchase by governments and state-owned enterprises of goods, services and works. Even though we're talking about something, therefore, which only regards, in this context, government, we know it's much further reaching. We know that the public sector are buyers, suppliers and consumers of these same services. So anything in this procurement has real benefit for everybody. ICT procurement, as we already know, security is already considered in this for a long time alongside other business needs, as is privacy. But there's an absence of accessibility. And to some degree, there's even been an absence of privacy when we think about persons which are maybe blind trying to use touchscreen devices with audio feedback. So we need to really understand what the impact of this is and how we can resolve it. Because at the moment it can lead to exclusion. Exclusion from a person with disability being able to access services, gain education, employment. It can lead to additional costs for the purchaser of these services and also missed opportunities for everyone. People in Australia, sadly, with a disability are nearly twice as likely to be unemployed as someone without a disability. In fact, of all OECD countries, Australia has the lowest employment rates, one of the lowest employment rates for persons with a disability. There's lots of different factors for this, but ICT procurement is certainly one that can help eradicate this, can move things forward if we put it in place.
We see time and again where when we're working, Neil and I myself both, when we're working with organisations and are looking at their internal systems, it's a lack of access to a lot of those internal systems that actually prevents people from being employed. They might be taken on, but then they can't do work with the systems internally.
That's very much, Andrew. And I was chatting with Jan Hauser, who works at Vision Australia. She's our National Employment Services Manager the other day, along exactly those lines.
And I've just jumped ahead a slide and it didn't play. Let's just see if we can play that again now.
Hi, Jan. Can you just tell us a bit about your role at Vision Australia, please?
Yes, I'm the National Employment Services Manager, and we run a DES contract, Disability Employment Services contract, that helps people who are blind or have low vision gain employment.
So do you have any examples of where someone's been challenged when going through a recruitment process to obtain a job due to inaccessible systems?
Yes, a couple actually. One of them is recently we had a woman who is very skilled and lots of experience in the role she was applying for. With the help of her consultant, she put through a really good application with key selection criteria and the cover letter. And resume, and then got through to the second interview, and they discovered that the images that they needed her to be able to access were not accessible for someone who's blind or has low vision, which completely took her out of the process, and she missed out, and she was incredibly disappointed, as you would be after all that effort. And we also have, quite often we have scenarios where they do online applications, clients do an online application, and we find that that's not accessible, and we usually can try and find a workaround with that, but it's not ideal, and it is very off-putting. Someone's trying to put in an online application and then they reach a part where they can't actually access it. It becomes very frustrating, and we then have to get onto the right person at the organisation to help us through it if that's possible, and sometimes it's not. So yes, there are quite a few scenarios like that happen frequently, really.
So we've got candidates which are perfectly qualified, suitable, that have got to that stage, but just purely down to the inaccessibility of the system, their opportunity is stopped at that point.
Yep.
What about people which are in employment? And I know I've heard talk of this, with various conversations with colleagues around Vision Australia, where people have actually lost their job, or certainly their growth within their career has been stunted due to inaccessible systems. Have you got any examples you could share with that?
Yeah, that happens too. Sometimes they, are moved to a different part of the organisation, and or their role changes for whatever reason, and they discover that system doesn't work for them. We do have assistive technology experts that can go in and have a look, but it's not always welcomed. We don't always have access. Particularly big organisations are a bit reluctant to have our assistive technology experts going in and looking at their systems. That actually happens often where IT departments are not as helpful as they could be.
Yeah, and therefore someone's career progress really can be, again, stunted.
Yeah.
What would you see as being the solution, the main requirements to avoid this, so that people can maintain, grow within their career and obtain, obviously, employment initially?
Well, I think it's really important that people, that organisations, and particularly big organisations that have got the resources to do it, have people go in and check their systems, so that they know before they even advertise that the role is accessible for our clients. This should happen all the time, really, and it doesn't. And this is why we're finding that a lot of clients end up halfway through a recruitment process and are knocked out of the race. So, it would be really great if we could have more education around it too, so that big organisations understand what's required.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. I really appreciate your time.
Okay, pleasure.
During the COVID crisis that we're all living in at the moment, The Guardian reported how that society had become more accessible. So the likes of Centrelink, education, workplaces, conferences like what we're all joining today had suddenly gone online. But it exposed as well that there was a lack of accessibility in many of these systems. Certainly AI Media reported that in the first 3 months of this year, their increase in captioning services had doubled. So we have a real challenge here, but procurement could have resolved this at the outset. If we'd actually purchased accessible systems, then there wouldn't have been suddenly this big crisis of how do we try and retrofit everything now to make sure it works so we can support everybody access digital communication. There are additional costs as well when we address accessibility after the procurement stage. The vendor's probably going to take very little responsibility if it wasn't in the terms of the agreement. The ability to make changes can often be very limited, and there's high remediation costs with something like a website even. It can cost a vast amount of money, or it can even need additional time or even systems to be replaced to ensure that they're accessible.
I've seen organisations where the HR system, for instance, has not been accessible, and the estimated effort to bring that up to accessibility for a variety of people with disability has just been almost prohibitive from at that stage. It would have been so much easier if it had been specified to the vendor and the vendor had accepted some responsibility for that up front.
Governments certainly are the largest purchaser of ICT as well in Australia, so we have a real amount of power here to actually make these changes. and there can be huge benefits. If we think of something like a photocopier, for instance, if we ensure that whatever we purchase has visual, audio and haptic feedback, then essentially we're ensuring that it's accessible for everybody, whatever medium that they want to can actually use this. Now, these products will be made if the requirements are there. Vendors will provide them if people are demanding them. And obviously they won't just sit within government, they'll be released to the public market as well. So we really can drive innovation going forwards.
And just a simple example then of your photocopier there is that little touch screen that's on the top. From somebody who might be in a wheelchair, just having that on a tilt arm so it can be tilted up is a very simple improvement that could be made. I mean, yes, we need to make some other improvements as well, but that would be a very simple one. Okay, so let's have a look at AS/EN 301-549, the Australian standard. It's actually the, if we spell that out, accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. And the current version actually refers to procurement of accessible ICT. Australia adopted directly from Europe EN 301-549 back in 2016. So our version is AS/EN 301-549:2016. This version that we have in Australia currently includes WCAG 2.0. We're in the process of releasing a version 2020, which has been updated in Europe to include WCAG 2.1. That should be released at the end of this month or very early in December on the current timeframes that Standards Australia are talking about. And we can expect to see an AS/EN 301-549-2021 here in Australia because Europe is looking at yet another release following the release of WCAG 2.2 in the first half of next year. So probably in the second half of next year we'll see another update. The standard includes a whole lot of functional requirements, statements that are intended to describe the functional performance of a variety of ICT products to enable people to locate, identify and operate the ICT functions, as Neil mentioned with the photocopier, for instance, to access the information provided regardless of their physical, cognitive or sensory abilities. And any differences in ability, they recognise in the standard that those differences might be permanent, they might be temporary, or they may even be situational. If we think about an ATM, my local ATM in the late afternoon has a lot of glare on that screen and is almost impossible to use at that time of day. So they talk about usage without vision, with limited vision, without the perception of colour. They talk about usage without hearing or with limited hearing, usage with no or limited vocal ability for oral interfaces, usage with limited manipulation or strength or limited reach, minimising the situation where photosensitive seizures might be triggered, usage with limited cognition, language or learning, and Neil mentioned privacy earlier.
Yeah, privacy as well. So if we think of that example again, Andrew, like ATM, and where someone might need audio output, it really is about ensuring that their privacy is preserved when using these systems, something which probably hasn't really been taken into consideration enough with standard security and privacy regulations.
Exactly. Then they break down the testable criteria for a whole range of different specific products. Generic requirements that will apply to everything. ICT with two-way voice communication, ICT with video capabilities, hardware, including speech output and stationary products. And when we're talking about hardware, this includes things like self-service kiosks, that we see in a Centrelink office, for instance, or an airline check-in, and includes not just what might be on the screen, but includes physical dimension criteria for wheelchair users, as well as reach for people with limited reach, and people who may be of short stature or extra tall stature having to work with those screens.
And we also have web again there as well. And it's good to point out that with the new standard, like you said before, it's 2.1, but it's very comprehensive documentation of it and how you actually achieve that standard for web.
That's right. I mean, a lot of what they've taken, they've pulled out of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but they've then added things for specific interactions for different types of ICT. But the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines has provided the backbone, if you like, for the standard. They also talk about non-web documents, which we see a lot of. Software products, and we mentioned earlier things like HR systems, documentation and support services, and ICT providing relay or emergency service access, which is really critical in Australia during times of bushfires, floods and so on. So they've got a very comprehensive annex in the version that will be released very shortly, where it breaks down the criteria by the functional requirements. The screen grab I've got on there talks about the different functional requirements across the columns, and then all the criteria are broken down. The little bit of screen grab I've got there refers to the generic requirements. And in that table then they indicate what is a primary relationship, the requirement that supports the functional performance, and they also talk about the secondary relationship where it partially reports. That means that they're giving two ways of looking at it. You really want to make sure that you're meeting those primary relationships, but it allows you to look at the partial support as well to get the best product. Neil talked about the driver from government, and the Commonwealth Government has adopted EN 301-549 in its procurement rules, as well as in its digital sourcing consider first policy. The South Australian Government has adopted it in its accessibility policy. New South Wales has adopted it in its Buy New South Wales policy. We're not sure, well personally I'm not sure. Neil, do you know about any other?
No, but we know that different states and territories have been certainly looking at this. There's a whole initiative as well internationally. This is obviously the European standard, but certainly our equivalent in Canada is very much looking at, have adopted this as well. So this working alongside Section 508 really is becoming an international standard, which obviously increases the purchasing power for us all.
And that's something that we've been looking for quite some time, is that harmonisation across as many countries as we can, so that organisations who are building ICT products can meet the same standard for every country that they might be delivering those into.
Yeah, exactly.
So what can your organisation do at this stage? Neil, I'll let you talk a little bit more about this one.
Well, certainly we need to be specifying the requirements in RFQs, RFTs. So often we don't see it included, and it's too late afterwards to then start saying that something needs to meet ATAG or WCAG or whatever the specifications are. So it really is important to have it up front. And therefore, if your vendor doesn't provide it, you've actually got you can go back to them. There can be a penalty clause, but you can certainly counteract it and ensure that they do deliver upon it rather than after the event.
So that sort of is stressing that the process of purchasing accessible ICT and making sure that it meets your requirements matters. Standards Australia next year will probably be looking at the adoption of an ISO standard, ISO 30071.1, which talks about the process of making sure that your product, that the process that you have internally for ensuring accessibility to your ICT products and provide some guidance around that. And Jonathan Hassel has already talked about this. The other point at the end is to stress that, yes, standards are a starting point, but you can't just rely on meeting the standard. And we really do need to make sure that we include usability testing of all our products, or checking in with our users even when we're specifying what the product might be, if it's something we're having built for us or we're building in-house. Because at the end of the day, we can meet all the standards that we might want to, but if it doesn't actually work for somebody, then we've still wasted quite a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of dollars.
Exactly, Andrew. Totally agree. Okay,
I think we've probably used up our time. feel free to get in touch. Neil will be hanging around for a little bit longer to answer any questions if we have any time left. But we're both more than happy for you to follow up with us with any questions on the matter of ICT